She was already walking away when she heard the horse scream. Clara spun around, and that's when she saw him. A man face down in the frozen mud, one hand still locked around his saddle, like he'd fought God himself before he fell. Her instinct said, "Leave him." Her father's voice in her head said, "Leave him." 18 years of warnings said, "Leave him." She knelt down anyway. She turned him over and the breath left her body. Because burned into that saddle clear as Judgment Day was the mark her father had feared his entire life. If this story finds your heart, subscribe to this channel, hit that bell, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The northern fence line of the Whitmore Ranch had been dead for 3 years. Clara knew that better than anyone. She was the one who stopped fixing it after the money ran out. She was the one who walked it every winter morning anyway, not because it mattered to the cattle anymore, since most of the herd was long gone, but because it was the one habit left that made the place feel like it still belonged to someone. She was 25 years old, and she carried the ranch the way old people carry bad knees. Every single day. Without complaining. Because what was the point of complaining when there was nobody left to hear you? Her father, Earl Whitmore, hadn't left his bedroom in 6 weeks. Not since the second fall. The doctor in town said the hip would heal. Clara wasn't sure about the rest of him. So she walked the fence line alone. The way she did everything alone. The cold that morning wasn't the ordinary kind. Montana in February has a way of making the air feel like something personal. Like the wind has a grievance with you specifically, and it intends to collect. Clara had her jacket zipped to her chin and her hat pulled low, and she was still losing the argument with the temperature when she came around the dead pine cluster at the far northern corner and saw the horse. The animal was down on its side legs, moving weakly, breath coming in ragged white clouds. Clara moved toward it automatically. A downed horse in winter was its own emergency. She'd learned that before she learned to read. You didn't walk past a downed horse. You just didn't. She was close enough to see the blood matted in the animal's coat when her boot caught something that wasn't frozen ground. Something that gave. She looked down. There was a man underneath her foot. Clara stumbled backward and nearly went down herself. "Hey!" She caught herself on a fence post. "Hey!" Nothing. She dropped to her knees beside him. He was face down in the mud and snow, one arm stretched forward like he'd been crawling when he lost consciousness. He wore a heavy canvas coat torn at both shoulders. His hat was somewhere behind him. She could see it half buried in a drift about 6 feet back. "Hey!" She grabbed his shoulder. "Can you hear me?" "Hey!" She rolled him over with both hands. He was heavier than he looked, all muscle and dead weight, and pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck. Pulse. Weak. But there. His face was a mess. A cut above his left eye had bled freely and dried in dark streaks across his cheek. There was bruising along his jaw that looked older, already turning yellow at the edges. His lips were pale in a way that made her stomach drop. Hypothermia. Or close to it. "Okay," Clara said to herself, to him, to the empty field. "Okay, you're alive. That's something." She stood and looked around. No other tracks that she could read. No truck on the road. The man had come from the northwest. She could trace where the horse had staggered and eventually gone down the trail, visible in the disturbed snow. They'd come a long way on foot, or close to it, after whatever happened to them. She looked at the horse again. It raised its head and looked at her with one dark eye. "I can't save both of you at the same time," she thought. She made a decision. She stripped off her outer jacket and draped it over the man's chest. Then she ran. She was back in 40 minutes with the flatbed, 2 wool blankets, and a length of rope. She'd called Doc Hennessy from the landline at the house, got his voicemail. Left a message that she'd need him out before noon. She hadn't called anybody else. She didn't know who this man was or where he'd come from, and until she did, she wasn't announcing his presence to the whole county. Her father's voice was already in her head by the time she climbed back down off the truck. "You bring a stranger onto this property. Clara, you better know who he is first. People don't collapse in other people's fields by accident." She ignored the voice and got to work. Getting him onto the flatbed was the hardest thing she'd done since burying her last 2 head of cattle in the fall. She got his upper body onto the tailgate, then braced herself and did what needed doing. Inelegant, exhausting his boots, dragging furrows in the snow until he was in, and she could cover him with the blankets. The horse was a harder question. Clara crouched beside the animal and ran her hands along its legs. No breaks that she could feel. Exhaustion, maybe. Dehydration. The horse had walked itself to the edge of what it had. She got the rope around its neck, talked to it in the low, steady way her grandfather had taught her, and eventually got it to its feet with a sound like old furniture being moved. "That's it," she said. Come on now." She tied the horse to the back of the truck and drove slow. The old cabin at the south end of the property hadn't been used for anything but storage since Clara was 17. It was away from the main house, which mattered. She didn't want her father knowing about this until she had more information than she currently possessed. She got the stranger inside, got him onto the cot that had been her grandfather's, and built a fire in the old iron stove before she did anything else. Then she started doing what needed to be done. She pulled his coat off first, checked his arms. His hands, no serious injuries there, some scraping, some bruising. She unlaced his boots and pulled them off, pressed her palm to the soles of his feet to check the temperature. Cold, but not gone. She was reaching for the saddle he'd been gripping, still attached to him. Somehow the strap looped around his wrist like he'd tied himself to it deliberately when she stopped. The saddle had a brand on it. Not a ranch mark. Not a livestock mark. A personal brand, the kind a man had made for his own gear, because it mattered to him, because it meant something about who he was. A black wolf beneath a broken moon. Clara sat back on her heels. She knew that mark. She had known it her entire life, not because she'd seen it in person, but because her father described it to her enough times that she could have drawn it from memory at age 8. He'd described it the way other fathers described monsters. The way other fathers described things that came in the night and took what wasn't theirs. If you ever see that mark, Clara, you walk the other way. You hear me? You walk the other way, and you don't look back. Her hands had gone very still. She looked at the man on the cot. His color was improving slightly. The warmth from the stove was doing its work. He was breathing steadily now, deep and regular. She looked at the saddle. She looked back at him. Walk the other way. But she was already here. She'd already brought him in. She'd already built the fire and pulled his boots off and pressed her hands to his feet to make sure he wasn't going to lose them. She'd already saved him. The question now was what to do with what she'd just found out. I didn't wake up for 4 hours. Clara stayed. She told herself it was because she needed to monitor him, which was true. Practically speaking, a person coming out of that kind of cold needed watching. But the honest answer was that she couldn't leave until she knew who he was. She sat in the old wooden chair her grandfather used to read in, and she watched the stranger sleep, and she thought about all the things her father had told her over 18 years. The Ryder family took everything from us. The Ryder family is the reason your mother isn't here. The Ryder family burned what they couldn't buy and bought what they couldn't steal. She'd grown up on those sentences the way other children grow up on bedtime stories. They were so much a part of her that she'd never really examined them, never pulled them apart to see what was inside. They were just true. The way certain things are just true when you're a child and the person telling you has a face full of genuine pain. I saw a man about to die, Clara thought. That's what I saw. That's what I acted on. She held on to that. At just past 2 in the afternoon, the man on the cot opened his eyes. He didn't panic. That was the first thing she noticed. A lot of people waking up in an unfamiliar place after losing consciousness would have come up swinging. He didn't. He opened his eyes and lay still for a moment, looking at the ceiling, taking inventory of himself. Then he turned his head slowly and found her. He had dark eyes, the kind of dark that looks almost black in low light. He looked at her for a long time without speaking. "You're at the Whitmore Ranch," Clara said before he could ask. "South cabin. You were down in the north field. Your horse is in the lean-to out back. She's going to be all right." Something shifted in his expression when she said the horse was okay. Something that looked very much like relief. "How long?" he said. His voice was rough, dry, abraded, but it was steady. 4 hours, give or take, since I found you. He moved to sit up. I wouldn't, Clara said. He stopped, looked at her again, seemed to be deciding whether she was the kind of person whose advice he should take. Then he let himself settle back against the cot. Thank you, he said, like he meant it. Not the reflexive kind of thanks people give when they don't know what else to say. He said it like he understood exactly what she'd done and what it had cost her. Clara nodded. The silence stretched. I need to know your name, she said. He looked at her steadily. Caleb. Caleb what? Another pause, shorter than the first. Ryder, he said. Caleb Ryder. Clara didn't move. She didn't let herself move. She kept her face where it was, her hands where they were, her breathing even and slow. Ryder, she repeated. Yes, ma'am. The fire popped in the stove. Outside, the wind made a long, low sound against the eaves. My father, Clara said very carefully, has spent 18 years telling me that your family is responsible for destroying everything we had. Caleb Ryder held her gaze. He didn't flinch. He didn't apologize. He didn't make excuses. I know, he said. He told me if I ever saw that brand. She nodded at the saddle still lying near the door where she'd set it. I should walk away. That sounds like something he'd say. Clara felt something tighten in her chest. You know my father. I know of him. A pause. The way you know of mine, I'd guess. She stared at him. I'm not here to cause you trouble, Caleb said. I was trying to get through your property line to the county road. My truck broke down 2 days ago on the west side of the ridge, and I was trying to... He stopped, breathed through something. It didn't go the way I planned. Clearly. I'm sorry for the trouble. You're not trouble, Clara said before she'd decided to say it. You're a man who nearly froze to death in my north field. The trouble part is the name. Something flickered in his expression. Not quite a smile, not quite, not one. Fair enough, he said. She brought him soup from the main house. She did it quietly while her father was asleep, moving through the kitchen, the way she'd learned to move around things that could break, careful, deliberate, not disturbing the air. When she came back to the cabin, Caleb was sitting up. He'd made it to sitting with his back against the wall, his injured leg stretched out in front of him. He looked better. Color in his face at least. He accepted the soup without comment and ate it slowly, watching her the way people watch something they're still trying to read. Can I ask you something? He said. You can ask. Why did you bring me in? Clara took her time answering. Because you were about to die. You knew whose saddle that was before you brought me in. No, she said. I found out after. He nodded slowly, like that meant something to him. Most people in this county, he said, would have left me there once they saw it. Maybe. Clara met his eyes. I'm not most people. No, he said quietly. I can see that. He went back to his soup. She sat in her grandfather's chair and watched the fire. After a while, he said, You're Earl Whitmore's daughter. It wasn't a question. Yes. He raised you alone. Since I was 7. He was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry about your mother. Something sharp moved through her. She kept her face still. You don't know anything about my mother. No, he agreed. I don't. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that. Silence. Then Clara said, Why are you back in Montana? He set the empty bowl down beside him. He looked at the fire. He was choosing something she could see it happening, deciding how much to say, or whether to say anything at all. My father is dying, he said finally. Clara said nothing. He reached out to me 3 months ago. I've been living out of state for 6 years. He asked me to come back. He paused. I almost didn't. What made you come? Caleb looked at her directly. He said there were things I needed to know. Things he should have told me years ago. Another pause. He said they had to do with this county, with the Whitmore name. Clara felt the hair on the back of her neck rise. What things? She said. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. That's what I came here to find out, he said. Doc Hennessy arrived at 4:30, wiry and no nonsense, the same as he'd always been since the year Clara was born. He didn't ask too many questions, he never had, which was one of the reasons Clara trusted him. He examined Caleb's leg, his ribs, the cut above his eye. He cleaned and closed the cut with 3 neat stitches. He told Caleb he had a bruised rib and a deep tissue injury in his left thigh that would make walking interesting for the next week. No permanent damage, the doc said, snapping his bag shut. You got lucky. Lucky, Caleb repeated. Lady found you in time. Half-hour later, you'd have been a different conversation. He looked at Clara with something that was either approval or mild exasperation with Doc Hennessy. It was hard to tell the difference. You need anything? I'm fine, Clara said. He raised an eyebrow at Caleb's saddle near the door, let his eyes rest on the brand for exactly 1 second. Then looked back at Clara with an expression that said he had a lot of thoughts he was keeping entirely to himself. I'll check back in 2 days, he said, and left. After the truck sounds faded, Caleb said he recognized the mark. Doc knows everyone's business in this county, has for 40 years. He won't say anything. Clara thought about it. He might say something to someone eventually. He's not a gossip, but he's not a vault either. We probably have a day or two before people start asking questions. We. She'd said we. She noticed Caleb noticed. Neither of them said anything about it. That night, Clara sat on the steps of the cabin in the dark and thought about the shape of the situation she was in. A writer. In her grandfather's cabin. On her family's land. She tried to feel what she was supposed to feel, the anger her father would feel, the suspicion, the righteous and inherited certainty that this man represented everything that had hurt them. But she kept coming back to the same thing. He cared more about the horse than his own wounds. When Doc Hennessy had examined him, Caleb's first question hadn't been about his own injuries. Is someone looking at my mare? Does she have water? He'd asked it twice before the doc had even gotten to the cut above his eye. Clara knew something about people who put horses first. It wasn't a guarantee of character, but it wasn't nothing either. She heard the cabin door open behind her. Heavy breathing, he was moving on the bruised rib, favoring it. You should be lying down, she said without turning. Probably. He lowered himself carefully onto the steps beside her, about 2 feet of space between them. She heard him exhale slowly, the kind of exhale that comes after you've been managing pain for a while and finally let yourself stop managing it for a second. They sat in the dark. You have questions, he said. About 100. Ask one, Clara considered. Your father. What did he tell you specifically about this county, about the Whitmore name? Caleb was quiet for a moment. He told me there were documents at the ranch. Things he'd kept. He said if he went without telling me where they were, I'd spend the rest of my life not understanding certain things. He paused. He wouldn't go into detail on the phone. He said it had to be in person. What kind of documents? I don't know yet. I haven't had the chance to look. A pause. The truck broke down before I got there. You were going to your father's ranch? Yes. Then what were you doing on my fence line? The county road on the west side is washed out about 2 miles up. I was trying to cut across your north pasture to reach the road on the east side. He looked at her. I know that's trespassing. Under the circumstances, I couldn't think of another option. Clara absorbed this. How long has your father been sick? About 8 months. It went fast. Something in his voice thinned out when he said that. Cancer. Liver. She looked out at the dark. I'm sorry, she said. You don't owe me that. I know, she paused. But you said it to me so. A long silence. The kind that doesn't feel empty. He's a complicated man, Caleb said finally. My father. I spent 6 years putting distance between us because I couldn't figure out which parts of him to trust and which parts to stay away from. He was quiet for a moment. Now he's dying, and he says there are things I need to know, and I'm no closer to understanding him than I was when I left. That's hard, Clara said. Yes. He looked at her. Your father, is he a complicated man? Clara let out a breath. He's the most certain person I've ever known. About everything. About what happened. About who was responsible. About what we lost and why we lost it. She paused. That kind of certainty is its own kind of complicated. Caleb nodded slowly, like he understood exactly what she meant. You ever question it? He said. What he told you about us? Clara turned her head and looked at him directly. I'm questioning it right now, she said. She let him sleep in the cabin that night. She drove back to the main house and sat at the kitchen table and stared at the wall for a long time. Her father's bedroom door was closed. She could hear him breathing through it, the slow, heavy breathing of someone sleeping with medication. He'd taken it better the past few weeks. The pain was harder. She made herself a cup of coffee she didn't really want and thought about what Caleb Ryder had said. There are things I need to know. His father had kept documents. Letters. He'd mentioned letters, hadn't he? Before he fell asleep, he'd mentioned almost as an aside that his father had written something about letters. Letters connecting the two families. Clara turned her coffee cup in her hands. She tried to think about it clinically, practically. A man she'd found in her field. A name she'd been raised to fear. A saddle with a brand that had lived in her nightmares since childhood. None of it added up to the story she'd been told. In the story she'd been told, a rider was someone who came in the night. Someone who took someone whose name was synonymous with loss. The man she'd talked to tonight had sat on a cold step and spoken carefully about a dying father and unanswered questions. He said there were things I needed to know. Clara got up, went to her father's closet, the one in the hallway, the one he kept locked, and stood in front of it for a long time. She'd never touched that lock. Not in 18 years. Her father had asked her not to, and she hadn't. She went back to the kitchen and drank her coffee. But for the first time in 18 years, she thought about what might be on the other side of that door. In the morning, the stranger was awake before her. She found him standing outside the cabin, both hands wrapped around a mug of something he'd found the old coffee tin on the shelf, apparently watching the eastern sky go from black to dark blue. His color was better. The bruising was more visible in daylight, but he was standing under his own weight, and the tension she'd seen in him yesterday, the particular tension of a body fighting pain, had settled slightly. He heard her coming and didn't turn around. Your mare ate, he said. I checked her at 5:30. So did I at 4. He looked over his shoulder at her. She's good. Better than last night. What's her name? Juniper. A small pause, the kind that carries something. She was my mother's. Clara filed that away. She stood beside him and looked at the sky. The color was doing something complicated now, the way it does in February in Montana when the cold makes the air entirely clear. Dark blue at the top, a pale almost green near the horizon, and somewhere in between something that was almost silver. I can drive you to your father's ranch today, Clara said. When you're ready. He turned to look at her. That'll take you 30 miles out of your way, he said. I know where it is. A pause. You don't have to do that, he said. I know that too. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at the sky. Can I ask why? He said. Clara thought about it. Because you mentioned letters, she said. And I want to know what's in them. She felt him go very still beside her. Clara, he said slowly. And something in the way he said her name, careful, like he was handling something fragile, made her turn and look at him directly. What? She said. He looked at her with those dark eyes, and she saw something in them she hadn't seen before. Not suspicion, not calculation. Something more like weight. The weight of someone who is carrying information and isn't sure yet whether passing it on will help or hurt. The letters, he said. One of them, my father mentioned one specifically on the phone before he couldn't talk much anymore. He stopped. Say it, Clara said. One of them was written by your mother. The air went completely still. Clara heard her own heartbeat. My mother, she said. Yes. To your family. Yes. Clara turned away from him. She looked out at the pale horizon and made herself breathe evenly, made herself stay in the moment, stay in her body, stay in the cold morning air, instead of the place her mind was trying to drag her. Her mother who had died when Clara was 7. Her mother whose name her father could barely speak without pain. Her mother who was the beginning and the end of the story she had lived inside her whole life. The Ryder family is the reason your mother isn't here. When was it written? Clara said. Her voice was very even. I don't know, Caleb said. I only know it exists. What did your father say it was about? A pause. He said it was about stopping something. Caleb's voice was careful, precise. He said she wrote it because she was trying to stop the feud before it got worse. Clara closed her eyes. Not as an enemy, but as someone trying to stop something. Her mother had gone to the Ryder ranch. Her mother had written to them. Her mother in the story, Clara had been told her entire life, was a casualty of the Ryder family's cruelty. But a person who was your enemy's victim did not write them letters asking them to stop the war. They just didn't. Clara opened her eyes. She looked at Caleb Ryder. Get in the truck, she said. She didn't tell her father she was going. She left a note on the kitchen table that said she had an errand and would be back by mid-afternoon. It wasn't exactly a lie. It wasn't exactly the truth. It was the kind of thing you leave when you're doing something. You know someone won't understand, but you're doing it anyway because some questions can't wait for the right moment. Caleb climbed into the passenger seat without comment. He moved carefully, favoring the bruised rib, but he made it without help and without complaining. They drove in silence for the first 10 miles. Then Caleb said, "You're scared." Clara kept her eyes on the road. "I'm not scared. You're gripping the wheel like it owes you something." She loosened her hands deliberately. "I'm going to the ranch of the family my father blames for his entire life's grief," she said, "to look at letters written by my dead mother that I didn't know existed. To do that with a man who was unconscious in my field 20 hours ago." A pause. "If I'm holding the wheel a little tight, I think that's earned." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Fair," he said. More silence. "Caleb," she said. "Yeah, whatever is in those letters." She kept her voice level. "I need you to understand, I can't promise how I'll react. I've been living inside one version of this story my whole life. If there's another version..." She stopped. Tried again. "I'm not saying I won't believe it, I'm just saying I might need time." He looked at her. "Take whatever time you need," he said. "I've been waiting 6 years to understand my own father. I can wait a little longer." Clara nodded. They drove. The road turned north toward the Ryder land, toward whatever her mother had written, toward the thing her father had kept locked up literally in that hallway closet, and in every other sense, for nearly 2 decades. The sun came up over the ridge, cold and clear and absolute, and Clara Whitmore drove toward the truth she'd been raised not to look for. The Ryder Ranch was 32 miles north of the Whitmore property, and Clara knew exactly where it was. The way she knew exactly where a bruise was not, because she sought it out, but because she'd spent enough years being careful not to touch it. She'd driven past the county road turnoff maybe 100 times in her life. Never once turned in. Her father, in the early years before his health started going, would take the long way around rather than pass that road. He didn't explain it. He didn't have to. The avoidance was its own explanation. Now she turned in. The truck bumped over a cattle guard, and she felt it in her chest more than her hands. Caleb sat with his elbow against the door, watching the land go by. He hadn't said anything for the last 20 minutes, and she hadn't pushed it. There was a particular kind of silence between two people who are both carrying something heavy toward the same destination. Not unfriendly, not tense, just weighted. "How long since you've been here?" she asked. 6 years. He didn't turn from the window. "Longer if you count being here in any real sense." "What does that mean?" I was quiet for a moment. "I left when I was 20, came back twice, stayed 3 days each time, didn't unpack." He looked at his own hands. "This is the first time I've been back with the intention of actually staying long enough to understand something." "And your father asked you to come?" He asked. I came. He paused. Those two things don't tell you everything that's in between them. Clara understood that without needing it explained. They pulled up to this main house. It was a large old structure. She could feel its age in the way it sat on the land, settled and permanent. The kind of building that had absorbed decades of weather and come out stubborn. A truck was parked near the barn, an older model, dusty. A light was on inside the house. Someone's here, Clara said. Margaret, Caleb said. She's been staying with him, housekeeper. She's been with our family 30 years. He opened his door slowly, favoring his rib. She knows you're coming. I texted her this morning. Clara stopped. You texted her? While you were getting the truck. You told her you were bringing a Whitmore to the house. He looked at her over his shoulder. I told her I was bringing someone who needed to see the documents. I didn't lead with the name. A pause. I wasn't sure how she'd take it. Clara climbed out of the truck. How do you think she'll take it now? I have absolutely no idea, he said. They walked to the front door. Margaret was a tall woman in her late 60s, white-haired, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades managing other people's crises without making them her own. She opened the door before they reached the porch, which meant she'd been watching from the window, which meant she was more unsettled than she looked. Her eyes went to Clara first, then to the saddle Caleb was carrying under one arm, then back to Clara's face. You're Earl's daughter, she said, not a question. Yes, ma'am. Something moved through Margaret's expression, complicated, layered, the kind of look that contains a history you haven't been given access to. You look like her, she said quietly. Around the eyes. Clara went very still. Like my mother. Yes. Margaret stepped back from the door. Come in, both of you. He's been asking for you since yesterday, Caleb. I told him you had an accident, and he spent half the night trying to get out of bed to find you. He shouldn't be trying to get out of bed, Caleb said. I know that. You know that. Nobody told him. She was already moving toward the back of the house. He's awake. He's been awake since 4. Fair warning, he's going to want to talk, and the doctor says he shouldn't for long. You'll have to be the one to stop him because he won't stop himself. Caleb glanced at Clara. She gave him a small nod. They followed Margaret down the hall. Thomas Ryder was a big man made small by illness. That was the first thing Clara registered. Not his face, not the room, but the sheer wrongness of a man who had clearly once been physically powerful, now reduced to this. He was propped up on pillows, and the effort it took him just to turn his head toward the door was visible. But his eyes were sharp. They went straight to Clara and stayed there. You brought her, he said to Caleb. His voice was rougher than Caleb's older, scraped but steady. She brought herself, Caleb said. I just came along. Thomas Ryder looked at Clara for a long time. Long enough that she had to make a conscious decision not to look away. You saved my boy, he said. He needed saving, Clara said. It wasn't complicated. No. Something shifted in the old man's face. No, I don't suppose it was. For you. He looked at Caleb. She knows why she's here. She knows about the letters. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, breathed, opened them again. All of it. Just that they exist, Caleb said. Just that one of them is from Catherine Whitmore. The name landed in the room like something physical. Clara heard it. Her mother's full name spoken aloud in this house, and felt something shift in her chest. Not pain exactly. More like the feeling you get when you find a door in a wall you thought was solid. Where are they? Caleb asked. Thomas moved one hand toward the bedside table. Bottom drawer, the brown envelope. Caleb went to it. Clara stood where she was watching the old man's face. He was watching her back. You hate us, Thomas said. Not accusing. Just matter-of-fact, the way people speak when they're too tired for anything other than directness. I was raised to, Clara said carefully. Your father's a good man who made a decision in his grief and never looked back. Thomas coughed, once controlled. I understand that. I made my own decisions in my own grief. None of them were right either. What does that mean? It means... He stopped, gathered himself. It means there's more than one way to love something and still lose it. He looked at the envelope Caleb had just pulled from the drawer. Open it. Both of you read it. I'll answer questions after if I'm still awake. Caleb held the envelope. He looked at Clara. She crossed the room. The envelope contained 4 things: 2 folded letters, 1 photograph, and a hand-drawn map of the county with 2 properties marked in red ink. Caleb set the photograph and the map aside and unfolded the first letter. It was typed short and dated 19 years ago, a year before Clara's mother died. It was signed by Thomas Ryder. Clara read over Caleb's shoulder. The letter was addressed to someone named Gerald Marsh, a name that landed somewhere in Clara's memory, like a stone dropping into water, creating ripples she couldn't quite trace. The letter was direct and specific. Thomas Ryder was formally withdrawing from a land negotiation. He named a parcel on the county's western ridge. He named a price that had been offered and rejected. He stated clearly that he had no intention of revisiting the matter. "Who is Gerald Marsh?" Clara said. Caleb turned to look at his father. Thomas was already watching them. "County Commissioner," he said. "Retired now. He had an office on Main Street for 20 years. Clara thought. "He was at my father's funeral, no. He was at the reception after. He came to the house." She tried to pull up the face that went with the name. "He brought a casserole." "He brings casseroles to a lot of people," Thomas said. His voice had gone flat in a particular way. "He's very good at appearing. I don't understand what he has to do with..." "Read the second letter," Thomas said. Caleb unfolded it. This one was handwritten. The handwriting was unfamiliar to Caleb, but Clara recognized it in the first 2 words, recognized it the way you recognize a voice in a crowd, the instant animal recognition of something that belongs to your first memories of safety. Her mother's handwriting. Clara's hand came up without her deciding to move it and pressed flat against the page before she could stop herself. Caleb went completely still beside her. "Take your time," he said quietly. Clara pressed her hand there for exactly 3 seconds. Then she made herself pull it back, and she read. The letter was addressed to Thomas Ryder. It was dated 8 months before Catherine Whitmore died. 8 months before the fire that took her, that took the original house that divided Clara's life into before and after. It read, "Mr. Ryder, I am writing to you directly, because I believe we have both been used by someone who benefits from our families not speaking. I have found records in my husband's office that suggest the original land dispute between our families was manufactured by a third party. I do not believe you are our enemy. I do not believe we are yours. I would like to meet and discuss what I have found. I am asking you to keep this letter private until we have spoken. Catherine Whitmore." Clara read it twice. Then she read it a 3rd time. Then she looked up at Thomas Ryder. "Did you meet with her?" She voice came out controlled, but only barely. "Yes," Thomas said. "When?" "About a month after she wrote that. We met twice. Once here, once at the county library in town." He was watching her carefully. "Your father didn't know." "Why not?" "Because she asked me not to tell him. Not yet. She said she needed more evidence before she brought it to him. She said Earl would go straight to confrontation if he found out before she had everything she needed to show him, and that confrontation without proof would make everything worse." Thomas stopped, breathed. "She was right about that. She knew your father better than anyone." Clara set the letter down on the bedside table with both hands, because she needed the surface to anchor herself. She was trying to end it. Yes. She was trying to end the feud before it destroyed both families. Yes. And then she died. The room went quiet. Thomas Ryder looked at her with eyes that had spent a long time carrying something heavy. "She died," he said, "and everything she'd been working toward died with her. And your father in his grief, and I understand it. God help me. I understand. It needed somewhere to put his pain. And we were the name that was already in his mouth." Clara heard her own breathing. "Did he know she'd come here?" she asked. "Not then, maybe not ever." Thomas's voice was rough. "I tried to reach out to him once, maybe a year after. He wouldn't take my call. I wrote a letter. I don't know if he read it. I let it go after that. I thought—" He stopped. Something crossed his face that looked like regret in its oldest, most weathered form. "I thought time would make it easier to say. It didn't." Caleb had been standing very still through all of this. Now he said quietly, but with a precision that cut through everything. "Dad, the map. What is the map?" Thomas shifted his eyes to his son. "The map is what your mother found," he said to Clara. "She drew it herself. The parcels marked in red, that's the land Marsh wanted. That's the land the dispute was really about. Not about the Whitmore fence line, not about the Ryder water rights. About those parcels on the western ridge that neither family owned, but both families bordered." Clara looked at the map. The two red marks sat in the gap between the Whitmore property and the Ryder property. She'd walked that ridge a dozen times. It was rough country, high elevation, rocky. She'd never understood why anyone would fight over it. "Why did he want that land?" she asked. "Mineral rights," Thomas said. "The state survey they commissioned in the 90s, the one the public never saw the full results of, found something on that ridge. Something worth enough money that a man might spend 20 years making sure neither family who bordered it ever got organized enough to claim it." Clara's mouth went dry. "He kept us fighting," she said. "Fighting families don't talk to each other. Talking families compare notes. Comparing notes leads to things like your mother did. Looking at documents, drawing maps, writing letters to the man her family was supposed to hate." Thomas closed his eyes briefly. "Gerald Marsh spent 20 years being the most helpful man in this county. The man you went to when you had a land dispute. The man who mediated. The man who wrote the agreements. He was right in the middle of every conflict between our two families, and he walked away from every one of them looking like a reasonable man." "While the conflict kept going," Caleb said. "While the conflict kept going," Thomas confirmed. Clara picked up the photograph. It showed 3 people standing in front of what she recognized as the county courthouse. On the left was a younger Thomas Ryder. On the right was a man she didn't recognize. Heavy-set, smiling with the comfortable ease of someone accustomed to being in photographs. And in the middle, her hand raised toward the camera as if she'd been saying something. At the moment the shutter clicked was a woman with Clara's eyes and Clara's jaw, and an expression Clara had only ever seen in the one photograph of her mother that lived on the mantelpiece at home. Her mother, standing between Thomas Ryder and Gerald Marsh. Not afraid, not captive. Standing as an equal, with the particular posture of someone who believes they are in the middle of doing something that matters. Clara's throat tightened painfully. "When was this taken?" she managed. "About 2 weeks before she died," Thomas said. "That was the day we went to the records office together. She was trying to get access to the survey results. Marsh was there. She didn't know he would be. He was there because he was always there, always in the right place. He saw her with you." "Yes. And 6 weeks later she was dead." Thomas said nothing. The silence was its own kind of answer. "The fire," Clara said slowly. Her voice had gone very quiet. "My father always said the investigation said it was an accident, an electrical fault." "I know what the investigation said," Thomas replied. "You think it wasn't. I think Gerald Marsh had a great deal of influence in this county in those years. I think the 2 investigators who handled that case both received promotions within the following year. I think your mother was the only person who had collected enough evidence to present to anyone official, and I think that evidence burned with the house." He looked at her steadily. "I cannot prove any of that. I want you to understand that. I have suspicions. I have a timing that I find impossible to accept as coincidence, but I cannot prove it." Clara set the photograph down. She stood there and let the information move through her, not fighting it, not accepting it, yet just letting it exist in the same space as everything else. She knew everything her father had built their lives around, everything she'd accepted as simply true. Because some things are given to you so early that questioning them feels like questioning gravity. Her mother hadn't been a victim of the Ryders. Her mother had been trying to save both families, and someone had made sure she couldn't finish what she started. "Why didn't you come forward with this?" Caleb asked his father, and Clara heard in his voice the particular quality of a question that has been waiting a long time. All of it. The letters. The map. Why didn't you take it to someone? Thomas looked at his son with tired eyes. Because your mother was gone by then. Because Clara's mother was gone. Because the man I would have had to take it to was the same man who'd been in every room of every conflict for 20 years and had the relationships to make it disappear. He paused. And because I was afraid. I'll own that. I was afraid of what happened to Clara Whitmore happening to someone else I loved. Caleb sat down in the chair beside the bed. He sat down, the way people sit when something has been pulled out from under them and they're not sure yet what's left to stand on. You should have told me, Caleb said. His voice was even, but the evenness cost him something. Yes, Thomas said simply. I should have told you years ago. I should have told a lot of people years ago. I made a choice out of fear, and I've spent 20 years watching that choice do damage I couldn't fix from a distance. He looked at Clara. I'm telling you now because I'm dying. And dying men don't have the luxury of waiting for the right moment anymore. Clara had been standing through all of this. Now she sat down too, on the edge of the bed, which was not something she'd planned. Which was not something that made sense, given that this man was a stranger, and this house was enemy territory, and her father would have been appalled. But she sat down because her legs suggested it, and she didn't argue. My father doesn't know any of this, she said. No. He spent 18 years blaming your family. Yes. And you never corrected him. Thomas met her eyes. I tried once. He wouldn't speak to me. After that, he stopped. I told myself it would cause more pain than it healed. I told myself the wound was too old. I told myself a lot of things that were really just different ways of saying I was afraid. He paused. None of that makes it right. I know that. Clara looked at the letter in her mother's handwriting still lying on the bedside table. I do not believe you are our enemy. I do not believe we are yours. Her mother had known. Her mother had figured it out alone quietly without telling Clara's father, because she knew he wasn't ready to hear it, and she had walked into this county and sat down with the man her husband called his worst enemy, and she had tried to do the hard thing, and it had cost her everything. Clara looked up. I need to think, she said. Take all the time you need, Thomas said. She stood, took the photograph, the map, and her mother's letter, and walked out of the room. She stood in the hallway outside the door for a long moment, just breathing. Then she walked to the front of the house and out onto the porch, the cold hitting her like a hand against the face, sudden and clarifying. She stood there with her mother's letter in her hands. She didn't cry. Not then. The feeling was too large for crying, too large for any single response. It was the particular sensation of a thing you've believed your entire life, gently but irrevocably coming apart in your hands, and finding that the pieces don't arrange themselves back the way they were. She heard the screen door behind her and didn't turn. Caleb came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the cold. He didn't say anything. He didn't offer comfort in any form that required her to receive it. He just stood there. She appreciated that more than she could have explained. After a while she said, Did you know any of that? No, he said. None of it. Your father kept it from you your whole life. Yes. How are you feeling about that? Caleb exhaled. Long. Slow. I'm feeling like a man who left his family because he couldn't trust them and just found out his instincts were right and completely wrong at the same time. He paused. Right that there was something being hidden. Wrong about what it was. Clara turned the photograph over in her hands. She's brave, she said quietly. My mother. In this picture, look at her. She doesn't look afraid. Caleb looked at the photograph she was holding. No, he said. She doesn't. She walked into a house she'd been raised to fear. Sat down with a man her husband hated. Tried to do the impossible thing. Clara's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that she was working to keep there. And nobody ever knew. For 18 years nobody knew. You know now, Caleb said. Clara looked up. Gerald Marsh, she said. Caleb's expression shifted, sharpened. Yes. He's still in this county. As far as I know, he went to my father's house after my mother died. He brought food. He sat at our table. Clara felt something tighten in her chest that was not grief anymore. It was something harder-edged and more specific. He sat at our table, and my father thanked him. Caleb said carefully, "Clara, I need proof," she said. "Your father said he can't prove it. But the survey results, the mineral rights records, those are public documents. Or they should be. The state survey results, the commissioner's financial records, the land purchase history on that western ridge." She looked at him directly. If he spent 20 years manipulating two families to keep that land out of play, there's a paper trail somewhere. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "You're thinking about going after him," he said. "I'm thinking about the truth," Clara said. "I'm thinking about what my mother died trying to do. I'm thinking about my father in that bedroom spending 18 years feeding grief that was built on a lie someone else told him." Her voice stayed level, but the words had weight. "And yes, I am thinking about going after him." Caleb was quiet. Then he said, "You can't do that alone." Clara held his gaze. "I know," she said. The wind came off the ridge and moved between them, cold and direct, and neither of them looked away. Somewhere behind the house, juniper shifted in the barn, and the sound carried in the silence, the way sounds do when everything else has gone very still. "My father has more documents," Caleb said. "He mentioned them before everything. He said there was a second envelope. Letters he received, not just the ones he kept." He paused. "And Margaret has been with this family 30 years. She was here when your mother came to this house. She knows more than she said." Clara turned back toward the door. "Then let's go ask her," she said, and she walked back inside. Margaret was in the kitchen when they found her standing over the sink, with her hands still and the water running, which told Clara she hadn't been doing anything except thinking since they'd gone outside. She heard them come in and turned the water off, turned around. "You have questions," she said to Clara. "About the night my mother came here." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Then she pulled out a kitchen chair and sat down in it, the deliberate way of someone who has been on their feet for years and has learned to take sitting as a serious matter. "Sit down," she said. They sat. Margaret folded her hands on the table. "Your mother came here 3 times total," she said. "The first time Thomas called me in because she arrived unannounced, and he wasn't sure what she intended. The second time they had an arrangement, and I made coffee and kept to the kitchen." She paused. "The third time—" She stopped. Clara waited. "The third time was different," Margaret said. "She came fast, faster than before. Her car she parked it crooked, which she never did. She went straight to Thomas's office and closed the door, and they were in there for over an hour." Margaret looked at her hands. "When she came out, she was very calm. The particular kind of calm that people get when they've made a decision they know is going to cost them." "What did she say?" Clara asked. "She said to me—" Margaret looked up. "She said, 'Margaret, if anything happens, the library on 5th has a deposit box under the name Mary Cole. Tell someone who needs to know.'" She paused. She said it once just like that, and then she walked out to her car and drove away. Clara felt every hair on her body rise. "Mary Cole," she said. "It was her grandmother's name," Margaret said quietly. "I looked it up once years later. I wanted to understand who she was." She looked at Clara. "I never told anyone. I wasn't sure it was still there. I wasn't sure it meant what I thought it meant. I was afraid." Clara looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Clara. "The county library on 5th Street, Clara said. "Still there," Margaret said. "Same building. They renovated the inside about 8 years ago, but the deposit boxes, they're in the basement. Old system. Nobody uses them anymore." She paused. "I checked 2 years ago. I walked in and asked. They said the boxes were still accessible if you had a key." Clara stood up. "Do you have a key?" Caleb asked Margaret. "No," Margaret said. "I never had one." She looked at Clara steadily. "But I think you might know where to find it." Clara went completely still. Margaret continued. "Your mother, the third visit. Before she left, she went to the bathroom at the end of the hall. Just for a moment. Thomas thought nothing of it. She paused. But I went in after she was gone, and there was a small scratch on the bottom of the soap dish, the kind you make when you're hiding something underneath. Clara felt the room tilt slightly. I looked, Margaret said. Nothing was there, not then. But I've wondered since it wasn't the bathroom at this house she'd want to hide something in. She looked at Clara with absolute steadiness. It was the bathroom at her own house, the house she went home to that night. The house that burned 6 weeks later. Clara was already on her feet and moving toward the door. Clara, Caleb called after her. She stopped. We go together, he said. She looked at him. At this man she'd found in her field 20 hours ago. At the saddle with the brand that had haunted her father's nightmares for 18 years now, leaning against the wall in the house where her mother had once sat and made plans and believed that the truth was worth the risk of speaking it aloud. Okay, she said. And they went. The drive back to the Whitmore property took 32 minutes. Clara drove the whole way with both hands on the wheel and her eyes on the road and her mind somewhere else entirely. Caleb didn't push her. He'd learned that much about her in less than 24 hours, she processed by going quiet, not by talking, and the worst thing you could do was fill the silence before she was ready to leave it. So he watched the land go by and let her think. She was thinking about a soap dish. That was the thing she couldn't get past. Not the letters, not the photograph, not Gerald Marsh and his 20 years of friendly manipulation. All of that was enormous. All of that would take weeks to fully absorb. But the image her mind kept returning to was her mother in a stranger's bathroom, pressing something beneath a soap dish, making sure it was hidden, walking out calm and deliberate, driving home. Going back to a house that would burn 6 weeks later. Had she known? Had she understood what she was walking into when she went to that records office with Thomas Ryder? Had she seen Marsh there and understood that the game had changed, that she was no longer just researching, she was now being watched? She said it once just like that, and then she walked out. Her mother had known something was wrong. She'd made a contingency plan. She'd hidden a key, and then she'd gone home. Clara pulled into this Whitmore property and stopped the truck in front of the main house. Sat there with the engine idling. She could have run, Clara said. Caleb turned to look at her. She had information that could have destroyed a powerful man. She knew he'd seen her with Thomas Ryder. She had to know she was in danger. Clara's voice was quiet and careful, the way it was when she was working through something that had sharp edges. She could have taken me and my father and gotten out of the county, gone somewhere else, started over, sent the evidence by mail from a safe distance. She paused. She went home. She went home, Caleb confirmed. Why? I was quiet for a moment. Because she wasn't going to let him run her out. Because she was trying to protect something. He paused. Or someone. Clara thought about her father. About Earl Whitmore at 35, proud and stubborn and absolutely certain about everything. The kind of man who would have walked straight at Gerald Marsh the moment his wife told him what she'd found. Found no strategy, no patience, no plan. The kind of man who would have gotten himself killed or discredited or both before the truth had a chance to breathe. Her mother had known that. Her mother had stayed because she was protecting her father from himself, and because she believed she had enough time to finish what she'd started. She hadn't had enough time. Clara turned the engine off. The bathroom, she said. In this house. My father renovated the main house after the fire, rebuilt everything on the original foundation. He kept the same floor plan. She opened her door. The bathroom at the end of the hall is in the same place it always was. Caleb was out of the truck and moving before she finished the sentence. Clara's father was awake when they came inside. She could hear him through the bedroom door, the slight shift of the bed, the creak of the frame that she'd learned to read the way other people read voices. Clara. His voice was rough with sleep. She stopped in the hallway, looked at Caleb. Something passed between them, quick and wordless, the kind of communication that normally takes months to develop between people. Go, he said quietly. I'll wait here. She went to her open. Earl Whitmore was sitting up in bed, hair uncombed, looking at her with the particular focused attention of a man who has been in a room alone long enough that any person walking through the door, becomes the most interesting thing in the world. Then his eyes moved past her to the hallway, and she saw them change. "Who is that?" he said. "Someone who's helping me with the fence line," Clara said. It wasn't the moment for the truth. The truth was coming, but it needed a foundation first, and the foundation was in the bathroom down the hall. Her father looked at her for a moment, with eyes that had always been very hard to fool. "You look like something happened," he said. "I'm fine." "Clara, I'll come talk to you in a little while," she said. "I promise. There's something I need to check first." She held his gaze. "Trust me." He didn't look satisfied, but he settled back against his pillows, which was the closest Earl Whitmore got to conceding a point. She pulled the door closed and went to the bathroom. The soap dish was original. She knew that without having to think about it, her father had kept all the bathroom fixtures from before the fire, salvaged what he could from what remained, rebuilt around them. He was sentimental about things that seemed small and unmovable, about things that seemed large. The soap dish was white ceramic built into the wall beside the sink, the kind that was installed during a period when people believed in permanence. Clara crouched in front of it. Caleb was in the doorway behind her. She could feel him there without looking. She ran her thumb along the bottom edge of the dish. The ceramic was cold and slightly damp. She pressed under the lip on the left side. Nothing. She moved to the right side and pressed, and something shifted, not much, barely a millimeter, but enough. She felt it before she understood it. The slight give of something that had been designed to look fixed but wasn't. She pressed harder, tilted the dish slightly upward on one side. Something fell into her palm. Small, metal, cold. A key. It was old, the kind of key that belonged to a lockbox, rather than a door, short and flat with a round head. There was a small piece of tape wrapped around it, and on the tape written in ink that had faded but was still legible in her mother's handwriting, "MC, for the right person, at the right time." Clara sat back on her heels and held the key in both hands, and didn't say anything for a long moment. Caleb said nothing either. The right person. The right time. Catherine Whitmore had hidden this key 18 years ago in a house she somehow knew might not survive, and she had trusted that whoever found it would understand what it opened and why. "She knew," Clara said. Her voice came out very quiet. "Yes," Caleb said. "She knew she might not make it. She planned for that." "Yes." Clara closed her fingers around the key, stood up, turned around. Her eyes were dry. She'd made a decision somewhere in the last 30 seconds, the kind of decision that doesn't announce itself, but simply arrives already complete. She could feel the shape of it, solid, certain, without room for hesitation. "The county library closes at 5, she said. Caleb checked his watch. "It's 11:40. Then we have time." She moved past him into the hallway. "But first, I need to talk to my father." Caleb caught her arm, not to stop her, just to make her look at him. "Are you sure you don't have to tell him everything right now? You can wait until you have the box, until you have everything." Clara looked at the hand on her arm, then at his face. "He's been in that room for 6 weeks, feeding a pain that was built on someone else's lie," she said. "I'm not leaving him in there one more hour thinking things that aren't true if I can help it." Caleb let go of her arm. She went to her father's door. She sat on the edge of his bed, the way she used to when she was small, before everything became about management, and logistics, and survival. Back when sitting on her father's bed meant simply being close to him. He looked at her face, and something tightened in his expression. Earl Whitmore had spent decades being afraid of the wrong things, but he knew his daughter's face, and right now her face was telling him something was coming. "What happened?" he said. "I need to tell you something," Clara said. "And I need you to let me get through all of it before you say anything. Can you do that?" He looked at her steadily. "Depends on what it is." "Dad." A beat. "Okay," he said. "Okay. Tell me." She told him. Not everything, not yet, because she didn't have everything yet, and she had enough of her father in her to understand that what you said without complete evidence could be dismissed and buried before it had a chance to become real. But she told him about the letters. She told him about her mother visiting the Ryder Ranch. She told him about the photograph. She told him about Gerald Marsh. She did not tell him about the key. Not yet. She watched his face through all of it. It went through things, a rapid sequence of things, each one visible for just a moment before the next arrived. Disbelief first, which she expected. Then a kind of physical rejection, the face of a man whose body is trying to refuse information, the way it refuses a bad thing you've swallowed. Then underneath it, something slower and more terrible. Recognition. Clara saw it happen the moment. Some part of him, some part that had always known, the story, had seams in it, began to understand that the seams had been put there by someone else. Catherine, he said. Just her name. Just that. She was trying to stop it, Clara said. She had figured out that someone else was keeping the conflict alive. She went to Thomas Ryder, not because she trusted him, because she'd figured out they weren't actually enemies. She was trying to build something, a case, evidence, something she could bring to you. She didn't tell me, Earl said. His voice had gone very far away. She knew you'd go straight at Marsh before she had enough to prove it. She was protecting you. Something moved across his face that was awful to witness. Not anger, which Clara had been braced for, but something closer to grief in its rawest form. The grief of a man who has spent 18 years being certain and just found out that the certainty was a cage someone else built for him. He came to the house, Earl said. After she died, he sat at my table. I know. He helped me with the insurance claim on the fire. He referred me to his lawyer. Earl's voice was completely flat now, the flatness of someone whose body has run out of the energy required for tone. He told me he was sorry for my loss. Clara sat with that for a moment. Dad. She reached out and put her hand over his. There's a deposit box at the county library. Mom hid a key to it before she died. I think she put her evidence there, everything she'd gathered. I'm going to go get it today. Earl looked at her hand on his. The man, he said slowly. In the hallway. That's not someone helping with the fence line. Clara held his gaze. No. Who is it? She didn't look away. Caleb Ryder, Thomas Ryder's son. He's the one who brought me to his father this morning. He didn't know any of this either. His father kept it from him the same way. She paused. He's been helping me. The silence that followed was the longest silence in a morning full of long silences. Earl Whitmore looked at his daughter. His face moved through something she couldn't fully name, too many things at once, too layered, too old. He looked like a man standing in a room whose walls have just turned out to be different from what he thought they were made of. Thomas Ryder is dying, Earl said finally. Not a question, he'd heard the name enough times to know the rumors. Yes. He kept this for 20 years. Yes. I was afraid, Clara said, not defending it, just stating it. Earl looked at the ceiling. A long, slow exhale. So was I, he said. I was afraid from the moment I understood she was gone. Afraid it was my fault. Afraid I'd missed something. Afraid the life we'd built wasn't enough to keep her safe. His voice was very quiet. It was easier to have a name for it. Someone to put it on. Dad, I know, he said. I know that doesn't make it right. He looked back at her. Go get the box, Clara. Go find out what she left you. Clara squeezed his hand once and stood. She was almost to the door when he said, Clara. She stopped. Tell the Ryder boy. Earl's voice caught on something for a moment. He pushed through it. Tell him I'd like to speak to his father, when this is done, if Thomas is up to it. A pause. There are things I should have said a long time ago. Clara felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight for a very long time. I'll tell him, she said. The county library on 5th Street was quiet at noon on a weekday, the way libraries in small Montana towns are always quiet. Not empty, but occupied in that particular focused way, where everyone inside is trying not to disturb the serious business of other people reading. Clara and Caleb came through the front doors, and Clara went straight to the reference desk without slowing down. The librarian was a woman named Dot, who had been there since before Clara was born. She looked up over her glasses when Clara approached, took in Caleb behind her, and said nothing about the bruising on his face, which was the kind of professional restraint that separated a small-town librarian from everyone else. Deposit boxes, Clara said. The ones downstairs. I need access. Dot looked at her carefully. Those haven't been used in years. I know. I have a key. Another careful look. Then Dot pushed back from her chair. I'll take you down. The basement smelled like old paper and cold concrete. The deposit boxes were along the far wall, a row of them, the kind with keyholes that looked like they hadn't been touched in a decade. Most had small adhesive labels beside the keyhole with a number. Some had no labels at all. Clara walked along the row with the key in her hand. She found it near the end. No label, just a keyhole that matched the key's profile. She put the key in and turned it. The box slid open. Inside was a manila envelope fat, with documents sealed with 2 overlapping strips of tape that had yellowed with age but held. On the front of the envelope in her mother's handwriting, for Earl, for Clara, for whoever needed to know. Clara picked it up with both hands. She stood there holding it for just a moment, this thing her mother had sealed and hidden and trusted to the future 18 years ago in the last weeks of her life. Open it, Caleb said quietly. She opened it. Tag. The documents were dense and specific, and organized with the precision of a woman who had understood she might not be alive to explain them. Catherine Whitmore had been methodical. Clara had not known that about her mother. Her childhood memories were of warmth and sound and presence, not methodology. But this was methodical. This was the work of someone who knew they needed to be understood by people who came after them without any additional context. There were 12 pages total. Survey results, the full ones, not the partial public version showing mineral deposits along the western ridge. A handwritten log of Gerald Marsh's land transactions going back 15 years, cross-referenced with the timing of every conflict between the Whitmore and Ryder families. Bank records. Clara didn't know how her mother had gotten these, but she had them showing deposits into an account she'd labeled GM Private that corresponded in timing to the resolution of certain county disputes. And at the back, a single handwritten page. Not a letter. Not addressed to anyone. Just notes written fast. The handwriting less careful than her usual. The handwriting of someone writing quickly under pressure, getting it down before something interrupted her. March 15th. Saw GM at records office. He knows I was there with TR. Called Earl, got voicemail. Cabinet and hall back panel. Copy of survey is there. If I don't? The sentence didn't finish. It just stopped. Clara stared at the unfinished sentence for a long time. If I don't get the chance to tell you myself. If I don't make it home. If I don't survive what I think might be coming. Her mother had come home that day and hidden a copy of the survey in the cabinet in the hallway. The hallway cabinet that burned with everything else when the house went down. But she'd also come here. She'd sealed this envelope and put it in a box under a dead woman's name and trusted that the key she left behind would find its way to someone who could use it. Caleb was reading over her shoulder. She felt him go still when he got to the unfinished sentence. She was going to call your father, he said. She'd tried. He wasn't home. She went home anyway, Clara said. Put a copy of the survey in the hall cabinet, knowing it might not be enough, knowing she might not be there to explain it. She turned the page over. On the back in handwriting that was steadier, written at a different time, probably earlier that same day, was one line. Whatever happens, the feud was never real. Don't let it outlive me. Clara set the page down on top of the other documents. She pressed her palms flat against the cool surface of the box shelf and breathed. Caleb said nothing. He understood somehow that there was nothing to say. After a moment, Clara straightened. She gathered the documents back into the envelope. She closed the box, pulled out the key, and held it in her fist. The bank records, she said. Her voice was controlled and specific. Are those enough? Enough for what? Caleb asked carefully. To go to the county attorney's office. She looked at him. Not to a local official. Not to anyone Marsh has relationships with. The state county attorney. Someone outside his network. Caleb thought about it. The bank records alone, probably not. But combined with the survey discrepancy, the difference between the public results and what's in here, and the transaction log. He paused. It's circumstantial. But it's organized, and it's documented, and it covers 15 years. He met her eyes. It's a starting point. That's all we need, Clara said. A starting point. She turned toward the stairs. There's something else, Caleb said. She stopped. The timing on the bank records, he said. I only glanced at them, but... He paused. Some of those transactions are recent, within the last 2 years. Clara turned around slowly. He's still doing it, Caleb said. Not with our families anymore. We're not useful to him anymore. But those accounts are still active. Whatever he started 20 years ago with the Ridgeland, it didn't end with your mother. Something cold moved through Clara that had nothing to do with the temperature of the basement. He's been at it this whole time, she said. The Ridgeland still hasn't been claimed by anyone, Caleb said. As long as neither family puts together a clear boundary claim, it stays in a gray zone. And in a gray zone, a man with county commissioner connections and a lawyer who owes him favors can maneuver indefinitely. Clara thought about Gerald Marsh sitting at her father's kitchen table, bringing a casserole, expressing sorrow, doing it for 18 years. He thought we'd never talk to each other, she said. Our families. He counted on us never being in the same room. Yes. And the only reason we are is because your horse went down in my field. Caleb held her gaze. Something quiet passed through his expression. That's right. Clara exhaled slowly. My mother wrote that the feud was never real, she said. She was right. But it did real damage. And the man who built it has been sitting comfortable in this county for 2 decades while my father fell apart and your family scattered. She gripped the envelope in both hands. I'm going to make that stop. I know, Caleb said. I'm going to need help. I know that too. She looked at him. This man she'd found in her field unconscious and half frozen. This man whose family name had been a ghost in her house her entire life. This man who had sat on her grandfather's porch steps in the dark and talked about his dying father with a carefulness that told her exactly what kind of person he was. Are you in? She said. He didn't hesitate, not even a second. Yes. Clara turned and went up the stairs. They were in the library's front vestibule, Clara pulling on her coat when the door opened and a man walked in. He was heavy-set, well-dressed for a small Montana town, the particular well-dressed of a man who wanted you to know he'd done well without it looking like he was trying. Silver-haired mid-70s, moving with the comfort of a person who had occupied every room he'd ever walked into. He stopped when he saw Clara. She stopped when she saw him. She recognized him the way she'd recognized Caleb's saddle, not because she'd seen it often, but because some things embed themselves in your memory with a particular insistence. The face of the man who sat at her father's table. The face of the man who said, "I'm so sorry for your loss," while her father wept. Gerald Marsh. He looked at her. Then his eyes moved to Caleb, and something shifted in them, a fraction barely visible there and gone. Clara had been watching for exactly that. Clara Whitmore, he said with the warmth of a man who prided himself on remembering names. I haven't seen you in it must be years. How is your father? He's well, Clara said. Her voice was completely even. Thank you for asking. His eyes moved to the envelope in her hands. She watched them move to it and move away too quickly. Just doing some research, she said before he could ask. Of course. He smiled. The smile of a man who had practiced it until it was frictionless. And your friend? A neighbor, Clara said. Marsh looked at Caleb for one more moment, the same fraction of a shift in his eyes barely there, and then back at Clara. Well, it's good to see you. Give my best to your father. He moved past them toward the reference desk. Clara and Caleb walked out the front door. On the sidewalk, Clara stopped. He recognized you, she said quietly. Yes, Caleb said. His voice was very controlled. He saw the envelope. Yes. She looked at Caleb directly. How long before he figures out what we found? Caleb met her eyes. He's a smart man who's been managing secrets for 20 years. He saw Earl Whitmore's daughter and a writer walking out of a library together carrying an envelope. A pause. He's probably already figured it out. Clara gripped the envelope tighter. "Then we move fast," she said. And they walked to the truck. Clara drove fast. Not recklessly, she was too much her father's daughter for reckless, but with the particular focused speed of someone who understands that the window they need is closing. Caleb sat in the passenger seat with the envelope on his lap and his phone in his hand, already searching. "State County Attorney's Office," he said. "Helena. Main line and an after-hours emergency contact." He looked up. "We need someone who can move on this today. Not next week. Today." "Call the main line first," Clara said. He called. Got a receptionist, asked for the deputy attorney handling land fraud cases, got transferred. Got voicemail. Left a message that was precise and calm, and contained exactly enough information to sound serious without sounding like something a person could safely ignore. Then he hung up and said, "We need a backup." "I know someone," Clara said. "Journalist. She's based in Billings, but she covered the county commissioner races 3 years ago. She called my father once, actually wanted a quote about land development on the Western Ridge." He hung up on her. A pause. "He was protecting the wrong thing." "You have her number?" "I can get it." She made the call while Caleb watched the road for her. The journalist, her name was Renata Souza, and she picked up on the second ring, which told Clara she was the kind of person who always picked up, listened without interrupting, while Clara gave her the short version. The land dispute, the manufactured feud, the survey discrepancy, Gerald Marsh, the deposit box, the bank records. When Clara finished, Renata was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, "I need to see those documents." "I know. Can you be in Copper Falls by 4 o'clock? "I'm leaving now," Renata said, and hung up. Caleb looked at Clara. "She believed you that fast?" "She's been pulling threads on Marsh for 2 years, Clara said. "She just didn't have the center of the web." She pressed the accelerator down a little harder. They were back at the Whitmore ranch by 1:30. Clara spread the documents on the kitchen table, the survey results, the transaction log, the bank records, her mother's notes, and she and Caleb went through them piece by piece, building the clearest possible sequence before Renata arrived. The picture that emerged was methodical and ugly. Gerald Marsh had positioned himself at the center of the Whitmore-Ryder dispute, going back nearly 25 years before Clara was born, before the feud had fully calcified into the permanent shape it eventually took. He'd drafted the original land agreements. He'd been the mediator in the fence line dispute. He'd written the water rights settlement that both families had signed and both families had later contested. Every time the conflict showed signs of cooling, something happened to heat it back up. A boundary marker moved. A rumor circulated. A document surfaced that one family insisted the other had falsified. Marsh's fingerprints weren't on any of it directly. That was the craft of it. He was always the reasonable man in the room, always the one trying to help. The conflict was between the Whitmores and the Ryders, and everyone in the county knew it, and Marsh simply happened to be there. Helpful, patient, professionally sympathetic every time it flared. Meanwhile, the Western Ridge sat unclaimed. The state survey, the full one, not the public version, had been commissioned 12 years before Catherine Whitmore died. It had found copper deposits along the ridge significant enough to be commercially viable. Marsh had been on the county commission at the time. The full results had been classified as pending further review, a designation that technically required annual renewal, but had been renewed without public notice every year for over a decade. Clara's mother had found the original survey. Clara didn't know how her notes didn't explain the how, only the what, but she'd obtained a copy and cross-referenced it with the public version and seen the difference immediately. She'd understood what it meant. She'd understood who benefited. And she'd understood that the only way to expose it was to get both families talking to each other, because divided, they were two separate complaints with no connective tissue, and united, they were a pattern. That was why she'd gone to Thomas Ryder. Not trust. Strategy. The kind of strategy that came from understanding people well enough to know that the truth alone was never enough. You needed the right people standing behind it. Clara stared at the transaction log and felt something in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite anger, and was probably the particular feeling of understanding someone posthumously, of seeing for the first time the full shape of who a person was when you'd only ever known the outline. She was brilliant, Caleb said quietly. He was looking at the same documents. Yes, Clara said. She had the whole thing mapped out. She just ran out of time to execute it. Clara's voice stayed even. We're going to execute it for her. Her father appeared in the kitchen doorway at 2 o'clock. He moved slowly, the hip still made everything slow, but he was dressed, which meant he'd made a decision. Earl Whitmore did not get dressed unless he intended to be present for something. His eyes went to the documents on the table, then to Caleb, who was standing at the far end, who met his gaze directly and didn't look away. The two men looked at each other for the first time. Clara watched it happen. Watched her father take in the face of Thomas Ryder's son, the same dark eyes, the same jaw. A generation removed, but unmistakably connected, and watched him work through something in real time. Something that was costing him, that was requiring him to dismantle 18 years of internal architecture while standing upright in his own kitchen. Caleb spoke first. "Mr. Whitmore," he said. No apology in his voice. No performance of contrition for things he hadn't done. Just a direct acknowledgement, one adult to another. Earl looked at him for a long moment. "You found her," he said finally. "My daughter. You were the one in the field." "She found me," Caleb said. "She pulled you in." "Yes, sir." Another long pause. Earl's jaw moved slightly, the internal working through showing up in the only place he couldn't entirely control. "Your father," he said. "He knew about Catherine." "He did. He's sorry he didn't come forward sooner. He asked me to tell you that directly." Earl looked at the documents on the table. His hand came up and rested on the edge of the table, steadying himself not from physical weakness, Clara knew, but from the weight of what he was processing. "Marsh," Earl said. The name came out flat and specific, the way her father said things when he had arrived at a conclusion, and it was no longer in question. "Yes," Clara said. "He was in this house. I know Dad. He sat across from me and told me—" Earl stopped. His hand tightened on the table edge. "He said the Ryders were trouble, that I should keep my distance, that the land dispute would resolve itself if I was patient and didn't do anything rash." His voice had gone very quiet. I thanked him. "You didn't know," Clara said. "I should have known." He said it simply, without self-pity, which was somehow worse than self-pity would have been. "Catherine tried to tell me something was wrong before she said the whole thing didn't make sense, that nobody benefited from us fighting, except people we weren't looking at. I told her she was overthinking it." He looked at his daughter. "She wasn't overthinking it." "No," Clara said. "She wasn't." Earl straightened. He looked at Caleb again, a different look this time, not the measuring look of the first moment, but something older and more exhausted and more real. "I blamed your family," Earl said. "For 18 years, publicly, privately, to my daughter who deserved better than to grow up inside my bitterness." He paused. "I'm not asking you to forgive that today. I just want you to know I know it." Caleb looked at him steadily. "My father did something similar," he said. "Different direction, same damage." He paused. "I think neither of our families gets to have clean hands in this, but that's not the same as being the cause." Earl looked at him for another moment. Then he pulled out a kitchen chair and sat down at the table. "Show me what you found," he said. Renata Souza arrived at 3:45, 20 minutes earlier than promised, in a car that was still dusty from the highway. She was small and fast-moving, with the particular energy of a person who spent most of their life in a state of organized urgency. She came through the door, shook hands with Clara, acknowledged Caleb and Earl with quick nods, and went straight to the documents on the table. She didn't speak for 11 minutes. She read everything twice, made notes on a small pad she'd produced from her jacket pocket, took photographs of each page with her phone. Then she looked up. "The bank records," she said. "Where did your mother get these?" "I don't know," Clara said. "Her notes don't say." Renata thought about this. "It doesn't matter for the story. It might matter for the legal piece. The survey discrepancy is the cleanest angle that's a public record violation, and we can document the chain of custody clearly." She tapped the transaction log. "This is circumstantial, but it's compelling, and it covers a long enough period that it establishes a pattern. A good attorney can work with a pattern." She looked at Clara. "You said you left a message with the state attorney's office. This morning, no call back yet." Renata picked up her phone, dialed. When someone answered, she didn't identify herself as press. She asked for a specific name, a name that apparently got you somewhere because within 2 minutes she was speaking to a person who was clearly not a receptionist. She was concise, specific, and gave just enough that the person on the other end asked her to hold. She held for 4 minutes. When she came back to the call, she listened more than she spoke. She said yes twice and "I understand" once, and then, with a look at Clara, "I can have digital copies to you within the hour." She hung up. "Deputy State Attorney Chris Ellard," she said. "She's been watching Marsh for 14 months on a separate matter, a municipal contract irregularity in Gallatin County. She didn't have enough to move." Renata looked at the documents. She thinks she might now. Clara felt the room shift, something releasing something that had been coiled tightly beginning to unknot. Earl made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "He's going to know something is happening," Caleb said. "We saw him at the library. He's had 3 hours." Renata nodded. "Then we move tonight. I file a preliminary piece online this evening, enough to get it on the record before anything can be suppressed. The attorney's office moves on their end in the morning." She looked at Clara. "Is there anything in these documents that you haven't told me? Anything that changes the picture?" Clara thought of her mother's last handwritten line. "Whatever happens, the feud was never real. Don't let it outlive me." "Nothing that changes the evidence," she said. "There's something personal." Renata looked at her. "Do you want it in the story?" Clara thought about it for a moment. Then she looked at her father. He was looking back at her, and in his face she saw something she hadn't seen there in years. Not certainty, which had been his whole expression for as long as she could remember, but openness. The face of a man who had set down something very heavy and didn't yet know what to do with his empty hands. "Yes," Clara said. "I want people to know who she was, what she was trying to do." Renata wrote something on her pad. "I'll treat it with respect," she said, simply without ornament. Clara believed her. The next 2 hours moved fast. Renata photographed every document and transmitted them to the state attorney's office. Caleb called Margaret, who confirmed she would speak on record about Catherine Whitmore's visits to the Ryder Ranch. She'd been waiting, she said, for someone to ask. Earl made one phone call himself to a man named Garrett, who had worked county records for 30 years and owed him a favor, asking about the annual renewal filings on the survey classification. Garrett called back in 20 minutes. The most recent renewal had been filed 8 days ago, same as every year, same signature on the authorization. Gerald Marsh had filed the renewal 8 days ago. 8 days ago, he had been, in the most technical legal sense, actively concealing the survey results. That was not circumstantial. That was a current documentable act. Renata made another call. When she hung up, something in her expression had changed. The organized urgency sharpened into something more specific. "Deputy Ellard is requesting an emergency document review tonight," Renata said. "She wants Clara and Caleb and Helena first thing tomorrow morning." She looked at both of them. "Can you do that?" "Yes," Clara said without looking at Caleb because she didn't need to. "Yes," Caleb said a half-second behind her. Earl looked at his daughter. "I want to be there." "Dad." "She was my wife," he said, quietly. "Absolutely. I want to be there when it comes out." Clara looked at him. This man who had raised her alone inside his grief, who had given her everything he had left to give, even when what he had left was diminished by pain, who had spent 18 years being wrong about the most important thing in his life, and had found out today, and was still upright, still present, still asking to be included rather than shutting the door. "Okay," she said. "We'll all go." At 6 in the evening, Renata's preliminary piece went live on the Billings Gazette website. The headline was "Careful Questions Raised Over Decades-Old County." land survey documents, suggest. But the first 3 paragraphs were specific enough that anyone paying attention would understand immediately what was being alleged and who was at the center of it. Clara sat at the kitchen table and read it on her phone. Caleb sat across from her reading the same piece on his. Her father sat at the head of the table, also reading, his reading glasses on for the first time in weeks. Nobody spoke until they'd all finished. Then Earl set his phone down and took his glasses off and said, "She got Catherine right." Clara had to look away for a moment. "Yes," she said. "She did." The piece described Catherine Whitmore as a woman who had identified a pattern of manufactured conflict and had worked quietly and strategically to expose it, who had documented her findings with methodical care, and who had died before she could bring them forward. It did not speculate about the fire. Renata had been careful about that. The speculation was something for investigators, not a preliminary news piece. But it said enough. Caleb's phone rang. He looked at it and stood up from the table. "It's my father," he said, and stepped into the hallway. Clara could hear his voice through the door. Low, careful, the voice of someone telling a sick man something he needed to hear gently. She heard him say, "The documents are real, and the state attorney is involved, and it's moving, Dad. It's actually moving." She looked at her father. Earl was looking at the hallway door. "He's a decent man," Earl said. "About Caleb. Not a question, a conclusion arrived at during the last several hours." "Yes," Clara said. "He is." "His father tried to reach out to me," Earl said. "Wrote me a letter. I threw it away without reading it." He paused. "I was protecting my anger. I thought I was protecting you." He looked at his hands on the table. "I thought they were the same thing." "They weren't," Clara said. "No." He looked up at her. "I'm sorry for raising you inside it. You deserved a cleaner start than that." "You were grieving," Clara said. "People grieve without handing the grief to their children," he said. "Or they should." He was quiet for a moment. "She would have told me to let it go. Catherine. If she'd lived, she would have told me right away, and I would have fought her on it, and she would have been right." His voice was steady and very tired. "She was usually right." Clara reached across the table and put her hand over his. They sat like that until Caleb came back in from the hallway. He stood in the doorway and looked at both of them, at this picture Clara supposed of a Whitmore and her father at their own kitchen table, and for a moment his expression was unguarded in a way she hadn't seen before. Something moved through it. Something that wasn't quite happiness, because happiness was too light for what this was, but was in the same family. "My father asked me to tell you something," he said to Earl. Earl looked at him. "He said he's sorry he waited so long. He said he's been carrying it a long time and he's tired and he'd like to put it down if Mr. Whitmore is willing." Caleb paused. "He asked if you'd come see him when this is done. He said there are things he'd like to say to your face." Earl looked at Caleb for a long time. "Tell him yes," Earl said. That night, long after Renata had gone back to Billings, after Earl had finally gone to bed exhausted in the bone-deep way of a person who has spent a day dismantling and rebuilding their own understanding of their life, Clara and Caleb sat on the porch in the dark. They'd been doing that a lot. The porch in the dark. She wondered if they'd keep doing it after this was over, then caught herself wondering which was its own small surprise. "Your father's phone," she said. "How did he sound?" "Tired," Caleb said. "Relieved. He cried a little." He paused. "He's not someone who cries easily. I haven't heard that in a long time." He looked out at the dark. "He said thank you. To you specifically. He said tell her I said thank you." Clara absorbed that. "Tell him he's welcome." Caleb nodded. The wind moved through the pines and settled. "What happens tomorrow?" he said. It wasn't really a question, they both knew what tomorrow was. Helena, the state attorney's office, the formal interview, the beginning of whatever process this became. He was asking something different. "Tomorrow, we go tell the truth to people whose job it is to do something about it," Clara said. "And then we come back here and figure out what's next." "And after that?" Clara looked at him. There was something in the question, layered, careful. The question of a man who has learned not to assume anything about the future and is asking anyway. "I don't know yet," she said, "but the fence line between your family's land and ours." She paused. "I was thinking it's been broken long enough." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Long enough," he agreed. She looked at the dark sky above the ranch. The same sky that had been there her whole life, above a property that had carried the weight of a manufactured grief for nearly 2 decades. And she thought about her mother driving home that last night, knowing what she knew, choosing to stay anyway. Clara had spent her whole life on this land. She'd never thought of that as a choice. It was just where she was, what she did, who she was. But sitting here now with everything her mother had left her, spread out on the kitchen table inside, she understood something for the first time. Staying was always a choice. Her mother had made it knowing the cost. Earl had made it inside his grief without understanding why. And Clara had made it every single morning for years out of habit, out of loyalty, out of something she'd never had a precise name for. She had a name for it now. The same name her mother had written at the bottom of a page she hid in a deposit box and trusted to the future. "Don't let it outlive me." Not the feud, not the hate. The love that was worth protecting. The life that was worth coming back to. Clara exhaled slowly. "We leave at 7, she said. "I'll be ready," Caleb said. And the night settled around the Whitmore Ranch quiet for the first time in a long time, the particular quiet of a place that has stopped holding its breath. They left at 7 exactly as Clara had said. Earl sat in the back seat with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes on the road ahead, which was the posture of a man who had made peace with going somewhere. He hadn't expected to go when he woke up yesterday morning. Caleb sat in the passenger seat. Clara drove. Nobody talked much for the first hour, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 3 people who had said enough the night before and were now simply moving toward the thing they'd decided to do. It was Caleb who finally spoke somewhere around the 40-minute mark, and what he said was not what Clara expected. "My father told me something last night," he said. "On the phone, after the main conversation." He was looking straight ahead. "He said he used to watch the light on the Whitmore property from the North Ridge when he was younger. Before everything went wrong between the families." A pause. "He said there was a period before the feud hardened into what it became when the Ryder family and the Whitmore family actually traded labor during harvest season. Your grandfather and his father worked each other's land." Clara glanced at him. "He said nobody remembers that now," Caleb continued, "because the feud replaced it. The conflict became the whole story and everything before it got buried underneath." He looked at her. "He wanted me to tell your father that." In the back seat, Earl was very still. "Harold Whitmore," Earl said after a moment. His voice was quiet and had something old in it. "My father. He talked about working with a man named Frank Ryder one summer. I was young, maybe 9 or 10. He mentioned it once, just in passing." He paused. "I'd forgotten that." "Frank Ryder was my grandfather," Caleb said. Another silence. Different quality than the first one. "2 families who once worked each other's land," Earl said slowly, "turned against each other by a man who needed them divided." "Yes," Caleb said. Earl made a sound that wasn't quite a word, more like the sound of something settling into place after a long time out of alignment. Clara kept driving. The highway unreeled in front of them straight and cold and clear, and she thought about her grandfather and Frank Ryder working side by side in some August heat decades ago, before anyone had drawn the lines that would cost both families so much. She thought about how thin the thread was between that moment and this one. How much had depended on how many small decisions made by people who didn't know they were making history. Her mother had known. Her mother had gone looking for that thread deliberately. Clara pressed the accelerator down and drove. Deputy State Attorney Chris Ellard was younger than Clara had imagined from the phone call, mid-40s, compact and precise, with the particular quality of attention that made you feel she heard everything you said and filed it instantly and accurately. She met them in a conference room with 2 colleagues and a recorder on the table, and a legal pad in front of her that already had notes on it. She shook hands with Clara first, then Caleb, then Earl, and when she shook Earl's hand, she held it a moment longer than the others. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. "I want you to know that what your wife documented is going to matter a great deal in what happens next. She did important work." Earl looked at her. His jaw moved once. "She always did," he said. They sat down and got to work. The formal interview took 2 hours. Ellard's colleagues asked most of the questions, methodical, specific, the kind of questions that revealed they had already done considerable background research before this morning. They asked about the chain of custody on every document. They asked about the deposit box, the key, the soap dish. They asked about Gerald Marsh's role in specific county proceedings going back 15 years, cross-referencing their own files as Clara and Caleb answered. The survey discrepancy was the thing that made one of Ellard's colleagues put his pen down and just stare at the documents for a moment. The full survey results against the public version were so clearly deliberately different that no reasonable explanation existed except intentional concealment. He looked up from the pages and looked at Ellard with an expression that needed no words. Ellard nodded once. Then she looked at Clara. "The annual renewal filing 8 days ago," she said. "That's current action. That's not historical misconduct, that's an active ongoing concealment that falls under current statute." She paused. "Combined with the Gallatin County matter we've been working, and now this, we have enough to move formally." "When?" Clara asked. "Today," Ellard said. "We'll be contacting Mr. Marsh's attorney this afternoon. I'd ask all of you to stay accessible by phone for the next 48 hours. Clara felt something shift in the room. Not relief. It was too early for relief. There was too much process still ahead. But something. The particular sensation of a machine that has been wound and wound and wound for a long time, finally beginning to turn. Caleb's hand found hers under the table. She felt it and didn't move away. They were back in the car by early afternoon. Earl sat in the back and closed his eyes. Not sleeping, Clara thought, just finally allowing himself to be still in a way that he hadn't allowed himself in a very long time. She drove. Caleb's phone rang 40 minutes outside of Helena. He answered, listened, and his expression moved through something fast. "Say that again," he said. Clara watched him from the corner of her eye. "When?" Caleb said. Then, "Okay, I'm on my way." He hung up. He looked at Clara. "My father," he said. "He took a turn this morning. Margaret says he's asking for me." He paused. "And he's asking for Earl." In the back seat, Earl opened his eyes. Clara looked in the rearview mirror, found her father's face. "We go to the Ryder Ranch," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Earl said. She changed direction at the next junction and drove north. Thomas Ryder was smaller than he'd been 2 days ago. That was the first thing Clara registered when she walked into his room, that the illness had taken another increment in just 48 hours, the way serious illness does, near the end, not gradually, but in steps, each one more definitive than the last. But his eyes were still sharp. They went to Earl Whitmore the moment Earl came through the door, and they stayed there. The two men looked at each other. Caleb and Clara both held very still. Margaret had disappeared back to the kitchen. The room was quiet and full of the kind of weight that accumulates when two people have been not saying something to each other for 2 decades. Earl crossed the room and sat down in the chair beside Thomas's bed. He sat down in it the way a man sits when he has decided to stay, not perched, not ready to leave, but fully there. "Tom," he said. He used the short name, not Mr. Ryder. "Tom. The name you used when you knew someone." "Earl," Thomas said. Another silence, shorter than the first. "I read Catherine's letter," Earl said. "The one she wrote you. Clara showed it to me yesterday." He paused. "She wrote to you because she trusted you could hear it." "She was a remarkable person," Thomas said. "She was," Earl said. "She was the most she was." He stopped, gathered himself in the careful way of a man who is carrying something liquid and is moving slowly so as not to spill it. "She saw something in you that she thought was worth approaching. After everything I'd told her about your family, she decided for herself." He looked at Thomas directly. "She was right, and I was wrong. I want to say that to you plainly." Thomas's eyes were wet. He didn't look away. "I should have come forward years ago," he said. I told myself it would cause more pain. I was protecting myself. I know that now. We were both doing things we told ourselves were for other reasons, Earl said. He wasn't forgiving easily. Clara could see the cost of each word in her father's face. He was forgiving precisely exactly without excess, the way you handle something that has required a great deal from you. I want to start from what's real. I don't know if we have enough years left between us for everything I'd like to say, but I want to start. Thomas lifted one hand from the blanket slowly, deliberately, and extended it. Earl took it. They shook hands for the first time in 20 years. And whatever the two of them had been to each other for all that time, enemies, strangers, the weights. Each had attached to the other's name. Something changed in the room when their hands met. Not fixed, not healed, changed. Clara looked at Caleb. He was watching the two men with an expression that was trying very hard not to be what it was. She looked away and gave him the moment. Thomas Ryder died 4 days later. He died in the morning quietly with Caleb in the room and Margaret in the hallway, and the first proper light of a February day coming through the window. Caleb called Clara 20 minutes after, and she could tell from his voice before he said the words. There was a particular steadiness in it, the steadiness of a person who has been bracing for something and has now arrived at the other side of it. He went easy, Caleb said. He wasn't in pain. Good, Clara said. Then, I'm coming over. You don't have to. I'm coming over, she said. She drove the 32 miles north for the third time in a week, and she stayed the whole day. She and Margaret made food that neither of them was hungry for, because that was what you did. You made food, you occupied your hands, you kept the house from going completely silent. Earl called in the afternoon and spoke to Caleb for 15 minutes, and what was said, Clara didn't ask about, and Caleb didn't offer. But when Caleb came back into the kitchen after hanging up, he looked like a man who had received something he needed. She let it be what it was. Gerald Marsh was formally charged 6 days after the Helena meeting. The charges came through the state attorney's office. Land fraud, willful suppression of public survey results, and 3 counts related to the Gallatin County matter that Clara hadn't known about until Renata explained it to her. Apparently, the Western Ridge copper rights were not the only situation Marsh had managed to keep frozen for his own benefit. There were 2 other properties, 2 other sets of parties who had spent years in low-grade conflict without understanding why their disputes never fully resolved. Renata's full piece ran on the day of the charges. It led with the survey discrepancy, but its spine was Clara Whitmore, who she was, what she'd found, what she'd tried to do. Renata had written it carefully, with the particular care of a journalist who understands that a person's legacy is a serious thing to handle. The piece described Clara not as a victim, but as an investigator, a strategist, a woman who had identified a systemic wrong and had built the groundwork for exposing it with whatever time and tools she had. It said she'd died before she could bring it forward, and that her daughter had finished what she started. Clara read it at the kitchen table with her coffee, and didn't say anything for a long time. Her father read it standing up, leaning against the counter, his reading glasses on. When he finished, he took his glasses off and folded them and stood there looking at the wall for a moment. Then he said, "She would have hated how long it took." Clara almost laughed. It was the truest thing he'd said in days. "Yes," she said. "She would have absolutely hated it. But she would have been glad it happened," Earl said. He looked at Clara. "She would have been glad it was you." Clara looked down at her coffee cup. "She would have been glad it was both of us," she said. The phone started ringing that afternoon and didn't really stop for 2 weeks. Reporters at Renata had not been the only journalist paying attention, and the story had enough elements to travel: corruption, family conflict, a dead woman's evidence preserved in a library deposit box for 18 years. Clara gave 2 interviews and declined the rest. She said what she wanted to say, and then she stopped saying it, because there was a difference between the truth being known and the truth being a performance, and she understood which one her mother would have cared about. Other calls were different. People from the county, some of whom had known her mother, some of whom were on their own parcels of land adjacent to the Western Ridge, called to ask questions, to offer information, to say they'd always thought something about those disputes had felt wrong, and now they understood why. A woman named Paulette, who ran a cattle operation 12 miles east, called to say she'd been in a boundary dispute with a neighboring property for 9 years, and Marsh had been the mediator, and she'd always felt like the thing was being kept alive on purpose. And did Clara think that was possible? Clara thought it was very possible. She told Paulette to call Renata. Through all of it, Caleb was there. Not constantly, he had a funeral to arrange a ranch to begin sorting through a life in another state that he was in the process of deciding what to do with. But he was present in the way that mattered. He called every day. He came over 3 or 4 times in those 2 weeks, sometimes for hours, sometimes just briefly once to help Clara move a fence post that had finally given up entirely, which they did in companionable near silence, and which felt somehow like the most normal thing that had happened since she'd found him in her field. She noticed she stopped counting the days since she'd found him. That seemed significant. 3 weeks after Thomas Ryder's funeral, Caleb told her he wasn't going back to Portland. He said it the way he said things, direct, without preamble, looking at her face to see how she received it. They were in the old cabin, the one where she'd kept him in those first days. She'd started using it as a kind of office somewhere to go when the main house felt too full of the recent past. He'd come by and found her there, and they'd talked for a while about the ranch, about the state attorney's timeline, about Margaret, and what she'd decided to do now that Thomas was gone. And then he said it. "I'm not going back." Clara looked at him. "Because of the ranch?" "Partly." He held her gaze. "And partly because I came here looking for answers, and I found them, and what I found changed what I thought I needed from my life." He paused. "I've been living 600 miles away from the only place I've ever actually cared about for 6 years, because I was angry at my father, and I didn't know how to be here without being angry. That reason is gone now." He paused again, shorter this time. "And there are other reasons." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "You're going to need help with that ranch," she said. "I know. And the fence line between your north pasture and my north pasture has needed work for 3 years." "I saw that," he said. "I was going to mention it." "We could fix it from both sides," she said. "Meet in the middle." Something shifted in his expression. Quiet, warm. The expression of a man who is not accustomed to things working out and is learning carefully to let them. "We could do that," he said. Clara looked at the old stove in the corner, the same one she'd built the fire in 3 weeks ago, the night she'd kept him alive without knowing who he was. She thought about the chain of things that had led to this moment. The frozen morning, the dying horse, the decision she'd made before she saw the brand on the saddle. The decision that came from something simpler and more fundamental than any of the names or histories or inherited conflicts, the decision to treat a wounded man as a wounded man, one choice, and then everything that followed from it. She saw a wounded man before she saw his name, Caleb said quietly. Clara looked at him. "What?" "Something you said once, about why you saved me." He held her gaze. "I've been thinking about it a lot." Clara had said it to Margaret, she remembered, or something like it. She hadn't known Caleb heard it. "It was the only thing that made sense at the time," she said. "It still makes sense," he said. "It's the best version of sense I've heard in a long time." Earl Whitmore drove to the Ryder Ranch on the 1st of March. He drove himself, which was the first time he'd driven anywhere in 2 months. He didn't tell Clara he was going until he was already back, which was exactly the kind of thing her father did when he didn't want to be talked out of something. He came home and sat down at the kitchen table and said, "I went and saw the place." Clara sat down across from him. "How was it?" "Big," he said. "Needs work, the north barn especially." He was quiet for a moment. "I talked to Margaret. She's going to stay on for a while to help Caleb get organized." He paused. "I told her she could call me if she needed anything. She seemed surprised." "I imagine she did," Clara said. "She knew your mother," Earl said. "We talked for a while." He looked at the table. "She told me things about how Catherine was in those last months. Things I didn't know. Small things. How she was when she worked. How she carried herself when she was working on something that mattered to her." His voice was careful and very quiet. I didn't think I'd get new things about her. Not this late. I thought I already knew everything I was going to know." Clara said nothing. Let him have the moment. "It was good," Earl said. "It was hard, but it was good." He looked up at his daughter. "That's a strange thing to say at my age about learning your wife was braver than you understood." "It's not that strange," Clara said. "Maybe not." He paused. The boy Caleb, he had some ideas about the Ridgeland, about both families filing a joint boundary claim now that the suppression has been exposed. The mineral rights would be shared, nothing to fight about if both families own it together. He looked at her steadily. "I told him I thought that was worth talking about." Clara felt something warm move through her chest. "It is worth talking about. I thought you'd say that." Earl almost smiled, the closest thing to a smile she'd seen from him in a long time. He's a sensible man. His father would have been proud of him. Clara thought about Thomas Ryder in those last days, the relief in him, the lightness that had come with the unburdening. He had been proud of Caleb. He'd said so in those last visits in the particular blunt way of a man who had waited too long and was not going to waste what time remained being indirect about anything. "Yes," she said, "he would have been." In April, Renata called with an update on the charges. Gerald Marsh had entered a plea negotiation. The state attorney's office was not accepting the first offer. Ellard had called Clara personally to tell her that with a directness that Clara had come to appreciate about her. The case was solid, Ellard said. The survey suppression alone carried significant exposure, and the Gallatin County charges added to it substantially. Marsh's attorney was managing a client who had spent 20 years believing he was untouchable, and the adjustment was not going smoothly. "There's one more thing," Renata said. "The investigators went back and looked at the fire report, the one from when your mother died." Clara held the phone very still. "They can't reopen it," Renata said carefully. "The evidence is too old, the original investigators are retired or gone, and the physical evidence is long gone. I want to be honest with you about that." She paused. "But the investigator who handled the original inquiry, one of the two who got promoted the year after, he's 81 years old, and he's been watching this case in the news. He called the state attorney's office last week." Clara's breath stopped. "He didn't confess to anything," Renata said. "He said there were things about the original investigation that he had questions about himself. That there was pressure at the time to close the case quickly. That he had never been fully comfortable with the electrical fault conclusion, but had been a young investigator with a family, and he had not pushed back the way he should have." She paused. "He said he wanted it on record, that's all. He said he wanted it on record before he died." Clara sat down. She hadn't realized she was standing until she was sitting. "It doesn't change the legal outcome," Renata said gently. "I want you to understand that. It's not actionable at this point, but it is." "It's someone saying they know," Clara said. Her voice was very steady. "It's someone saying out loud that my mother didn't die because of a faulty wire." "Yes," Renata said. "That's what it is." Clara closed her eyes. She thought about her mother writing that last unfinished sentence, "if I don't," and the word that was supposed to come after it. The sentence that had been interrupted. By what exactly, Clara now had a clearer idea of. Not just by circumstance, by someone who had made a choice. And now an old man, 81 years old, lying awake at night, with the weight of something he hadn't done, had picked up a phone and called. It wasn't justice. It wasn't enough. It would never be fully enough. But it was witness. Someone saying, "I know what happened." Someone refusing this late to let it be buried all the way. "Don't let it outlive me." "Thank you for telling me," Clara said. "There's something else in the case file that I think you should know," Renata said. "Something from the original investigation that was in the report, but that nobody ever followed up on." She paused. "There was a witness, a neighbor who lived about a mile from your property at the time, an older man. His statement was taken the morning after the fire. He said he'd seen a truck parked on the county road near your property late that night. He gave a partial plate number and a description." Clara's hand tightened on the phone. "The plate description was never run," Renata said. "The follow-up interview was never done. The original investigators noted it as a possible sighting, not corroborated, and moved on." She paused. The neighbor has been dead for 12 years, but his statement is in the file, and the partial plate. Another pause. The investigators working the current case cross-referenced it with vehicle records from that period. It was a partial match for a truck registered to a company, a shell company, one of several that Gerald Marsh used for county contract work in those years. The silence that followed was complete. Clara sat in it. She sat in the silence of understanding, not proof, not the kind of thing that would ever become a charge or a conviction, not something that would ever fully close, but understanding. The particular terrible clarity of a picture becoming complete enough that you could see what it was, even if the edges were still blurred. Her mother had not died in an accident. She had been killed by a man who brought casseroles to grieving families and sat at kitchen tables and said, "I'm so sorry for your loss." "Clara," Renata said. "Are you there?" "I'm here," Clara said. I know what it is," Clara said. "I need a few minutes." She set the phone down. She sat at the kitchen table in the house her father had built on the foundation of the one that burned, and she let it move through her, all of it, the whole wave of it, without trying to stop it or manage it or find the right thing to feel. Her mother had known she was in danger. Her mother had hidden a key in a soap dish and put an envelope in a deposit box and written half a sentence and gone home anyway, because she had decided that what she was doing was worth the risk, and she had been wrong about having enough time, but right about everything else. Clara sat with that for a long time. Then she picked up the phone. She called Caleb. He answered in 2 rings the way he always did. She didn't say hello. She just said, "Can you come over?" "I'm already getting my keys," he said. He came. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, and she told him everything Renata had said, start to finish, not leaving anything out. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he didn't say that he was sorry, or that it was terrible, or any of the things that were true but insufficient. He said, "What do you need right now?" Clara looked at him. "I need this to mean something," she said. "Everything she did. I need it to have built something that lasts past the legal case and the news story and the charges." She paused. "I need it to have been worth what it cost her." "It already is," Caleb said. "Tell me how." He leaned forward. "Because she wrote that letter to my father and he kept it. Because she hid that evidence and it survived. Because you found me in that field 3 weeks ago, instead of 3 weeks earlier, before I had a reason to be honest with you, before I understood what my father was trying to tell me." He held her gaze. "Because 2 families who were told they hated each other are sitting in the same kitchen right now, and your father drove to my family's ranch last week for the first time in 20 years, and they're talking about a joint land claim." He paused. "That's what she built, Clara. She built the conditions for all of it. She just didn't live to see it run." Clara looked at the table. The surface her mother had probably sat at in a different house in a different kitchen in the time before. Planning. Working. Believing the truth was worth the cost of pursuing it. "She would have liked you," Clara said. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I hope so," he said. "She would have liked that you put Juniper first," Clara said. "That first morning. When Doc Hennessy came, you asked about the horse before you asked about your own ribs." She looked up at him. She cared about things like that. About what a person's instincts were when they were hurting. He held her gaze. And in his face, she saw something she'd been watching accumulate over the last 3 weeks since the field, since the cabin, since the porch in the dark, and the library, and the conference room in Helena, and the fence post. They'd moved together in the cold, all of it, accumulating into something that had a shape now. Something that had been built the way real things are always built. Not all at once, but piece by piece in ordinary moments that turn out not to have been ordinary at all. "What happens now?" he said. Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she stood up, went to the window, and looked out at the north fence line. The dead one, the broken one. The one she'd been walking alone every winter morning for years. "Now we fix the fence," she said. "From both sides. We file the joint land claim. We figure out what the 2 ranches look like when they're not being held apart by someone else's agenda." She turned back to face him. "And we stop asking what happens next and start making it happen." Caleb stood. He crossed the kitchen and stood beside her at the window. They looked at the fence line together at the place where her land ended, and his family's land began, at the broken boundary that had been broken not by nature or time, but by deliberate human malice maintained and nursed across decades, by a man who understood that divided people were manageable people. "Your mother would have fixed this fence herself if she'd had the chance," Caleb said. "Yes," Clara said. "She would have. We fix it for her." "Yes." He looked at her directly. "And for us." Clara met his eyes. "And for us," she said. The following spring, Clara found a photograph she hadn't known existed. It was in a box of her mother's things that had been stored in Earl's closet for 18 years. The locked closet, the one she'd stood in front of the night. Everything began the one she hadn't opened because her father had asked her not to. After everything, Earl had unlocked it himself one afternoon and carried the box to the kitchen table and said quietly that he thought it was time. The photograph was small, slightly overexposed the way photographs from that period often were. It showed two women standing at a fence line. One was her mother, recognizable, immediately the eyes, the posture, that way of standing, that said she was fully present wherever she was. The other woman was older, wearing a work shirt and boots, squinting slightly against the sun. Clara turned it over. On the back, in her mother's handwriting, "Eleanor Ryder and me. The North Fence. She says it's been broken for 30 years. We both think someone should fix it." Clara stared at the photograph for a long time. Eleanor Ryder. Thomas's mother. Caleb's grandmother. Two women at a fence line 30 years before any of this, already saying out loud what needed to be done. She showed it to Caleb that afternoon. He held it in both hands. He looked at it for a long time. "They knew each other," he said. "Yes." "Before the feud locked everything down." "Yes." He looked up at her. His eyes were bright with something. "It's been going on longer than any of us knew. This us finding our way back to this." He looked at the photograph. "My grandmother and your mother standing at the fence, saying someone should fix it." He looked at Clara. "And here we are." "Here we are," she said. They fixed the fence that week properly, this time with new posts and wire, and 2 days of work in the early spring cold. They started at opposite ends and worked toward each other. Earl came out on the second day and watched for a while, leaning on a post with his arms crossed. And at one point, he went back to the house and came back with coffee in a thermos and handed cups to both of them without saying anything about it, which was the most his particular brand of warmth knew how to do. And it was enough. When they met in the middle, Clara and Caleb were both cold and tired, and covered in the particular combination of mud and wire grease that comes with that kind of work. She looked at him across the last gap in the fence, and he looked at her, and they drove the last post together, one hand each on the mallet, the impact reverberating up both their arms at the same time. The fence was whole, the boundary was clear, not a wall. A line that said, "This land is known and cared for, and belongs to people who have agreed." Clara stood back and looked at it. At the long line of it running north, connecting two properties that had been held apart for a generation by a lie they hadn't known was a lie. She thought about her mother at this fence line with Eleanor Ryder. She thought about her mother in a library basement, sealing an envelope, trusting the future to finish what she'd started. She thought about a frozen morning and a man face down in the mud, and a choice made before she saw the brand on the saddle. The choice that turned out to be the first step of a journey that had been waiting a long time for someone to start it. "Because I saw a wounded man before I saw his name." One sentence, one choice, one morning. And from that morning, everything else, the letters, the key, the photograph, the charges, filed the fence, mended the two families standing on either side of a boundary line that was finally, for the first time in 20 years, something other than a sight of grief. Clara looked at Caleb. How was looking at the fence, then at her with the expression she'd come to know, the one that had started as careful and become open, that had started as measured and become real, that had been built post by post and word by word over weeks of ordinary moments that turned out to have been the most important moments of her life. "Your mother would be proud," he said. Clara looked out at the long line of the mended fence, at the land that had spent 18 years inside someone else's story at the North Field, where it had all started on a frozen morning when she'd made the only decision that had ever made complete sense to her. Yes, she said. She would. And the Montana sky opened up enormous and clear above the Whitmore Ranch and the Ryder land and the long straight fence between them. And for the first time in nearly 20 years, there was nothing broken left to fix.